Thank you very much. I'm still very traditional, so I'm not millennial. I'm going to take you through where we came from and why millennials were engaging for us and why we decided to do a millennial study. Some of the challenges that we've had as a marketing agency is always, looking for insights and trying to understand who our customers, consumers, people that we talk to on a daily basis are. And in this kind of whole sphere, millennials start to become very, very important simply because of the size and the nature of them. And once we started to dig through this process, we recognized a few things. One is there is no African study on millennials. And most studies, most global studies, tend to have a study on Africa as an entire block. And the data that comes out of it is very predominantly very driven by one of two big markets. It's either very Nigeria-specific or very South African-specific. And we said we don't believe that those really talk to millennials within the context of an African millennial. The second thing was that we really wanted to understand whether the global millennial patterns actually work for the African millennials. And so this study was a joint effort between EXP, it's a marketing agency, and Reach, which is a technology company, that has a really interesting purpose. And their real purpose for their app is to help millennials plan their money. So what the app does, it actually tracks your spending. So once you download the app, it tracks your spending, and it helps you as a millennial to be able to manage what you currently have in your wallet. So once we started to look at the data that was coming out of this, it was very quick. We could see very quickly what's happening within the millennial space from a money perspective. We could tell where they're spending their money, which outlets they're actually going to, what they're specifically buying, where the money is coming from. So the app picks up all the data from the marketplace, and it's both works on a smart as well as SSD platform. So any notification, any SMS notification that gets onto your phone, the app is able to distill that information and pick out all this data. So we thought this was really exciting. So we come together with Reach to try and understand what is the real pattern behind it. How do we track? How do we save? How do we manage our money? But more importantly, it also told us what's happening within the retail space. Then we thought, okay, we want to know a little bit more around the millennials. So how do brands use the marketplace to be able to get competitive data and quantitative research? So a little background around what you're going to see today. What you can expect today is an overview of the millennials in 3 specific markets, and I know the questions will be why those 3. So the perspective was taken out of Lagos, Accra, and Nairobi, and we specifically left out South Africa, and I'll explain why in a minute. So for those of you, there are West Africans in the room, so they understand that within the West African context, just the size and the scale of Nigeria alone informs a lot of what happens in West Africa. So the way we look at it is that actually Nigeria sets the pattern for a lot of things. Music, fashion, direction is actually built out of Nigeria simply because of the size and the scale. And then into Accra, which is, again, very much the distiller of things. We look at Accra as the distiller of things. So if you look at where a lot of sort of top education comes from within the context of the African market space, you will find that Ghana leads in that process. And then we honestly believe that Nairobi just makes it global. From Nairobi, it just spreads everywhere. Now, why did we leave out South Africa? Only for 2 reasons. We didn't want to skew the data, and we recognized that if we added another market into the plan without having understood what the core impact is of those 3 markets, we were not certain that we would come up with what is a truly African study. The second thing is that a lot of the South Africans we speak to say they are going to Africa. So we kind of thought, okay, they're obviously not in this continent, so we're going to leave them out for a little bit. And I say that facetiously. But they do say they're going to Africa, right? Exactly. But South Africa comes into the next phase of this research in 2020 because we really want to see whether there is a pattern towards it. So in 2020, we're going to add South Africa, we're going to add Ethiopia, and we're going to add Zambia. And there will be reasons why we're focusing on that trend. So the big question we ask ourselves is, what if these people didn't exist? Because every time we hear the term millennials, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Internet. What else? And they tend to be kind of like, there's this generation that is kind of blocked together with some negative terms generally. A lot of people say they're lazy, they are entitled, they are tech savvy, so everybody accepts that, they're leading the tech space, they're free-spirited, and they're all about me. This is kind of the general description when we talk about millennials that come out of the context of what comes to mind, and especially when we're managing millennials in the workplace. There's always like, these people are so difficult to manage. Like, we have to create a whole new template because they just refuse to abide to any sort of set rules or policies. I can see people nodding their heads. But kind of said, okay, what is a millennial? And how are millennials described? Because I think that's also an important factor in trying to understand this group of people. So it's unscientific, but generally it refers to a cohort of people that are born between 1986 and 98. So in the workplace, your typical millennial, the oldest millennial, would probably be 38 years old. And I'm sure by the time they get to 38 years old, they probably have families and they are starting their second or third career. Some of them are already into some level of management. So I'm not sure that they can be called irresponsible, lazy, think about me first. Then there's another generation that came after that, which is referred to in marketing terms as the Generation Z. And Generation Z are really born into the tech space. Millennials adopted into the tech space, and they're just quicker to adopt into it. But Generation Z are really the children that are now actually 17, 18, 19 years old. You got them in your homes. They are still not economically part of, yes, active, but they're getting there. And there'll be a whole new generation of people that need to be kind of talked about. So there's a lot of myths around this generation called the millennials, and we wanted to debunk some of those myths. So some of this might validate some of what you think, and some of it might challenge some of your thinking, and some of it might be, okay, we've got questions around this. So I'm just going to give you the data as we got it. So what we did was, we had the data from 12 million people that are part of the app, right? And then from that data, we decided to distill into more qualitative stuff. So we utilized about 600 people. So anybody has kind of done some research, they'll understand the context of the correctness of that data. So 600 is quite a big database when you're actually doing a research. Most people kind of look at 200 for the size that we're looking at. So out of 12 million, so when you see all the stuff that says raw data that comes out of a bank of 12 million, when you start to see the more quality stuff that came out of a database of about 600 people. And that would be within the context of that millennial. So we wanted to understand, what do they really feel? And why is it that there is such a big discussion around millennials? So the first thing is the numbers. So if you look at the total population of Africa, the fact is that our economic demographic will come out of millennials. It's as simple as that. 50% of millennials are going to be in the workplace by 2030. In fact, 50% of your workplace is going to be millennials by 2030. So this is a real serious problem. The second thing is that it's likely to peak by 2050. Generation Z is going to take over of a millennial. So you're now looking at 75% of people in the workplace are going to be between what you call a millennial and a Gen Z. And we think that 32%, if you look at the numbers, it's going to overtake it by about 32, 33% of the workplace by 2050 will be the Gen Zs. So the question we asked ourselves is that, why is there so much interest around them? And I think for two reasons. First, the spending power outmatches their ambition. This is, everybody knows. But their influence seems to have outlasted and outsized a lot of global brands. So people are afraid of millennials. They're afraid of their power of social media. They're afraid of what they do when they get onto a Twitter and when they talk about your companies on Facebook. The second thing is, for millennials, experience is everything. Everything they want is total, instant inclusion. And they're really interested in the changes and how that affects them. The third thing, which was a scary part about us in the continent, is that this generation is more likely to live in cities than any other previous generation. So they could double the population of the continent's population living in cities by 2040. Now, we are not certain that our cities are able to provide the jobs required, the infrastructure required, and the innovation required to be able to meet this growing population. So millennials are important to us. From a branding perspective, everything seems to be, their view of the world is via a digital lens. And what that means simply is that everything that's formulated for them has to come off a digital lens. The challenge we've got, and where the dissonance starts, is that the policies that are formulated and the people who formulate, implement, and monitor them have little or no understanding or even regard for them. So there's a real distinct default action for a millennial to question authority. Why? Simply because policies are made by people that don't understand them. And that sense of wanting to question is what is seen as disruptive, disloyal, disengaged. The second thing is that the digital revolution has completely changed their impact of the environment and their worldview of the environment. So if something is not digital for a millennial, it's probably not worth pursuing. It's not important. If I can't tweet it, and I can't share it, and I can't talk about it freely, it's not for me. And we're finding a lot more of that happening, especially within the continent. So if you think about it, what would the size of the whole be? We just say, let's just get rid of all the millennials within the continent. Like, let's just not talk about them. Let's just ignore these people. Between 70 billion and 75 billion of the spend by 2025, bigger than any other African generation. The second thing is that actually, they can reduce the poverty rate within the continent by a massive percentage. Why? Mainly due to two things: economic opportunities and the way they view the world, and employment opportunities. The third thing, which is actually quite interesting, is that they could push our economic growth. So we really can't ignore the millennials. And as people who manage millennials in the workplace, it's like a really important requirement for us to start to engage and utilize them, because they are Africa's next economic pushers. And that's what everybody refers to as our economic dividend, the population. But we're never going to be able to see the impact of them if we don't start to understand the way that we can make them relevant and engaged within the communities and within the workplaces. So this report covers what we defined as 3 key areas for us. So it was social, monetary, and professional. And why did we call them currencies? Why? Because we think that millennials' spend can technically be housed into these 3 components: how they spend their money, how they spend their connections, so the entire influence that they have in the social world, and actually how they spend their time. And those 3 components become really key to understanding how they behave as individuals. So if I said, okay, you know, the kind of confidence levels for this study, we're sort of at a 99% confident level, so anything I tell you is true. No, I'm joking. So anything the study says to you is 99% accurate. That's the sample base that we utilized of 11,000 people, and then the qual base of about 600. So the other thing that we did was we actually used the median and not the mean. And that was really important for us, so that we could take away any sort of outliers. So if you look at the methodology, we look at the transactions, and we looked at all the big data that came out of the transactions. And then, like I said, we used the median. All the data is anonymous, and it's administered electronically. So the one thing we also recognize is that when we do a survey with a millennial, depending on who's doing the survey, the answers that you get are slightly different. So if Carol Abade, looking like this, goes and asks them how much money they spend, somehow their employer seems to pay them 3 times what they're actually earning. And depending on how that research is administered, we tend to find that there's a lot of, you know, integrity issues in the data. So all of the data went out electronically and completely anonymous. So I'm going to talk about, the first one that we're going to talk about is their social currency. So the first thing we found out is actually, contrary to popular belief, money isn't everything for a millennial. So they wield their power in different ways. And they give their allegiance where they can expend those energies. So we asked them to tell us about the future and what they think and what is in their mind. So we wanted to know what brands come to mind when you talk about a millennial. How do they connect? How do they consume information? Where can we put information that is relevant for them? And it turns out that they're actually more circumspect than we thought. Everybody thinks that social media and all the social media influencers are everything. They believe things that they're told, and they only care about their friends, and they only care about the things that their friends tell them. The data says that actually their reliance on friends and media is actually not true. The true source of information for a millennial is their parent, their sibling, or another family member. Now, all this says is that why is there then this big drive around people thinking that millennials are permanently on their cell phones and they only get their information digitally? Because the same way they curate their posts is the same way they know that other people are curating their posts. So they're aware that there is a lot of data on social media that is curated. So if they want to find out the real source of information, if they want real source of truth, they will default to parents. So if you really want to talk to about a millennial about what is really important to them, start with your parents. The second thing was that look at a successful business person. So within the context of the African space, everybody kind of thinks that my role model is I want to be successful in business, and they do want to be successful in business. But the first influencer is always going to be their parent. And then look at that. Social media bloggers. So the second question we asked, because we wanted to verify the information, was, okay, if they're seeking guidance and honesty, who is the single source of misinformation? Surprisingly, 40% of them don't believe anything they read on social media. And really, given the rise of social media influencers currently, and people kind of imagining that millennials are going to be driven through social media, the fact is African millennials, whilst they see them as personalities, they leave them there as personalities. So they drove very strong demarcations between entertainment and information. Social media bloggers and celebrities are for entertainment. When they want information, they're going to go somewhere else. And we're going to talk about where they're going to go. There. So, where do they go for true source of information? They go to your website. So the question is, how many companies' websites are regularly updated with relevant information for millennials? They still view the website as the most trusted and reliable source of information. Now, in many companies, I actually don't know where the website management sits. With which department? With marketing. And yet, a lot of the marketing people would put stuff on the website that they think would be driven by social media influencers. And this is where those disconnects start. So, as HR practitioners, the question would then be, what is our role in managing the content that goes into the company's social media, into the company's website, as a real source of information when we're dealing with millennials? Because social media to them is fairly fickle. The second thing we talked about is doing good, social currency. Okay, so within this social currency, we asked them, which brands do you think are actually doing good in your community? Now, this is brands across everywhere. So this is a consolidation of brands. Safaricom is only in East Africa, I think. So 21% of them kind of remembered the good that that company does. But the problem is that 10%, nothing comes to mind. So again, we start to question, as HR practitioners, I don't know where CSR sits in our companies in terms of the things that we're doing. How much are we actually engaging the people that we manage? And if 50% of that workforce is going to be millennials, how much are we engaging them to be able to understand the social good that we're doing as companies? Because this is a blank space. Nothing comes to mind means there's a blank space. And then there's a whole host of others. So the real opportunity is to really capture the millennials' share of mind, is to be able to come into that. Doing good is good business. If you want to attract the right talent within the space of millennials, we've got to start doing some good. And then we kind of looked at the future. And what's interesting out of this was that actually, peace and stability is the biggest challenge for millennials within the context of Africa. Now, we don't find this in the global research. So the peace and stability in the country is actually higher than finding a job or finding love or health. So this is what threatens them the most. And remember, we're looking at 3 of the big cities within the continent, and within those 3 big cities, there is general peace and stability, but this is still a big worry. And if we extrapolate that across other countries, I don't think South Africa would be very different in respect to that conversation. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was, okay, so what is this whole kind of social stuff that we need to, and what can be the thing that we can tap into from a social currency perspective? First is that, are you appealing to their families? If mom and dad are still the greatest source of trusted information, are you appealing to mom and dad as an employer? The second thing is they're circumspect of social media. So how much is our marketing or our marketing departments doing in terms of positioning our brands on social media platforms and with celebrities and with social media influencers, because that's a big drive for marketers at the moment. And your website is critical. It's the number 1 go-to place for millennials within the context of Africa. And we talked about your open air sky. It's open. Anybody can take that space as a company or as a brand if you're looking to attract people who think that doing good is important. And we're going to go through that a little bit when we look at the professional currency of a millennial. So our key takeouts for us, if we sort of said, what is your role in this social currency space? And I don't mean social currency from a social media perspective, but how can you earn more currency as a business in terms of providing real information that is relevant for millennials? So the first thing is millennials are seeking affiliation, conversation, and information. And if you think back to what we talked about and how millennials are viewing everything through a digital lens, all they're saying is that give me information that makes me socially relevant. So within the workplace, how do we make the millennials within our workplace socially relevant within the spaces that we provide to them? Because I think there's always been this, again, big drive. Even in my company, we always kind of talk about, we're tired of millennials. We just want to hire people who can get in and do the work and don't question and we slowly started to debunk some of those myths. Okay, what are the real challenges? The real challenges is that they're asking questions. Why are they asking questions? Because somebody created a policy 20 years ago and nobody has asked why it exists. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So if they're looking for affiliation, then their key purpose is social relationships. But not just any social relationship, because of the current trend. A lot of these guys still stay at home, they just can't check out. I think many of us, by the time we were 18, 19, we were ready to get out of home. But right now we've got 23, 24-year-olds, 26-year-olds. I see the mothers nodding. We're keeping them at home longer than we should keep them at home. And they're happy to be in hotel mom and dad. And so what's happening is that's where we see the disconnects, because mom and dad is still all about the traditional, especially within the African context. The traditional, okay, by the age of 25, you need to be married, and why are you still here? And what is a real job in Africa? What is a real job? You have to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a teacher. You want to be a musician? This is not a real job, you got to go to school first. So this influence is still very, very strong, and it creates a lot of dissonance. And that is what we find in the workplace. So the second thing is they're looking for exchange. You must exchange your social currency. This conversation cannot be a one-way conversation. So rules and policies are great, but if we don't engage them in a conversation, then you start to get the disconnects. And it's a really difficult task to do, because we're not saying make them special in the organization. What we're saying is that the affiliation and sense of community is still very important to them. So this sense of belonging can very quickly be tapped into if you're running a business that provides them the space and the ability to belong to something. They want to belong to something. They don't want just to be another number in the workplace. And the challenge we've got is that we make them another number in the workplace because they just come in and go so quickly. So how do you build affiliation and how do you build a sense of community in a short space of time in a millennial's mindset? The second thing is the deep digger for information. So the millennial is going to be the first person who's going to find out that 20 years ago your company did something that they didn't like. This is what they do for a living. And so how are we curating the information that we have as a company? And as practitioners, how are we presenting information that becomes relevant for millennials within the workplace? The third thing is actually they're demanding more. They're saying that it's a two-way thing. If you give, you get. Now, how does that look? So in this era of fake news, and the desire to be savvy, and the desire to be inspired and trusted sources of information, how do they make their decisions? Because if you can't give them enough information to be able to allow them to come back to you to make a decision process, they start to moderate their sources of information from other places. And within the context of a company, that becomes really dangerous. I was actually seeing a quote on the table, and one of what did it say? It was actually quite interesting. It said something about the people in this company. What did it say? Do you have them on the table? There are cliques in this company. What did it say? It was actually quite a telling one.
We work in silence. We don't share knowledge or information.
That's true. We hear that a lot.
People have agendas in the organization.
Yeah, that's a nice one. People have agendas in this organization. And that comes out of the context of lack of accurate information. So the whole sort of give and thou shalt get, they're expecting something to give something back. So the second thing we looked at is their monetary currency. This was a real shocker because I think the general misconception is that within the monetary space, there's a big expectation that it's all about money for that particular generation. Why? Because their inspiration, their kind of, like I said, their ambitions totally outmatch their spend. And what it said to us is that actually 57% of Africa's millennials earn below $200 a month. And 30% of the global millennials are unemployed. So if that's the amount of money they're earning, and we also know that the bankers and the telcos take up a lot of their money, they dominate the urban millennials' existence. So what does that mean for us? The sad numbers are that these people are looking for employment. And this is the first time that we've actually seen a study that tells us what's in their wallet. They're not big earners, but their power is not in their cash. Their power is in their numbers and in their attitude. The interesting statistic is that despite the fact that they earn so little, 19% of them put money towards some sort of saving, investment, insurance scheme. Now that's really interesting. And healthcare doesn't feature in that investment scheme either. So popular opinion is that they have money, they like the nice life, they like brands. Millennials are big babies that don't want to grow up. They don't spend on housing because they can't afford it. They rely a lot on their parents for their additional sustenance. So if you think about it, if the average millennial earns $200 a month, how do they survive is the question that is constantly asked. So this is the kind of, if you look at the numbers, 50%, 48%, $100 or less. And then if you take maybe $300 and up, that's really the highest earning potential of millennials within the continental space. What are they spending it on? Airtime, the bank charges, and unusually, betting. That's becoming a really big spender within the continent. And if you look at a lot of the markets outside, in fact, even within South Africa, the number of sport betting companies and the number of gambling companies are just growing every day. And the reason they're spending on betting is the kind of hope for the future. In some ways, we try to justify it. We said, okay, betting is a way of saving because you're trying to put away money for some big, some big thing about to happen in your life. But all it's saying is that there is a desperate need for us to be able to look at what it is these kids are spending money on and how, as a business, we can start to assist them in their need for saving and investment. And then there's all the other things, bills and utilities, business expenses, and how that data kind of is captured is, within the app, we can see exactly which betting companies, where they're actually spending it on, how much airtime they're buying, how much they're actually spending on data. And that's kind of like the consolidated outlook. So what it says to us is, look at the transaction size. So you think, okay, this is a typical transaction size. It's $1. So that 10 Rand airtime is where the money is going. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's a lot of transactions, and it even tells you how many times they're spending that $1 on airtime, for example. But compare that to banking and transfers at $21. That's about 260 Rand odd that's going into bank charges. So we then have a comparison data of what we call the lifestyle 5x5. And these are the 5 transactions that we see the most: transport, groceries, restaurant, entertainment, and online shopping. Now, online shopping starts to pop up really big, again, within the space of the millennials' life. And we even went further to say, okay, what's in that online shopping? So we kind of look at transport. Uber is number 1 on the top of there. And then it's all the sort of petrol transport companies that come into transport. And then your groceries, your supermarkets, game, and a whole list of supermarkets. Remember, this is consolidated data, so it could come from anywhere within the continent. But the transaction size is, I think, what's important. Look at the transaction size on transport. They're spending up to $5 a day on transport. That's a lot of money when all you're earning is $200 a month. And then you look at the transaction size on your grocery bills. Restaurants, $4. And this would be kind of like your fast food restaurants. There's a lot of spend going in there. And then entertainment, clubs and concerts and plays, GoTV and Netflix, all the stuff that's going on the digital platforms. Big spend, $7 to $8. I think it's coming out of mom and dad's pocket. They just haven't realized that. And online shopping, kind of looks at the online shopping transactions. And we went a little deeper to say, okay, what are people actually spending on online shopping? So it's small things. It's like the cell phone cover. It's like the screen protector. It's like that really cool pair of happy socks, the transaction value of about $5. And that stuff's being delivered to the offices. So the excitement for them is that, oh, you're also into online shopping. So when the package gets delivered to your office, and you'll find, actually, if you just kind of did the data around your own offices, find out, of all the stuff that gets delivered to your offices, do the check. How many of them are going to millennials? Most of it, yeah. There's always a package at reception for somebody. It's a small package, but it's a package. It's relevant. So for us, the thing was, okay, are we priced well in the market for millennials? Are we future-facing in terms of the brands or the companies that we work with? Are we actually looking at millennials an important part of our economic development if what they're earning is $200 a month? The second thing we looked at, which was, I think, important, is the professional currencies. So these guys they're here to stay. We wanted to find out what is it that actually makes them tick in the workplace. And it was actually quite interesting because we discovered that they live their passions. Because of the amount of information that they get, they're actually looking for simplicity. So they want something that unifies their passion to the job. It's as simple as that. There's a whole lot of stuff. So the job and their passion is the same thing. So if you give them something they love to do, they do it well. If you give them something they don't love to do that doesn't fit their passion, they check out. And they want a unification of those two things. So authenticity and loyalty are actually very important. So popular belief is they are lazy and they don't want to work. They want the easy way out, they're disloyal, and they're entitled. We hear this all the time. But actually, what we found out was interesting, is we asked the millennials, which is the smartest way to make money today? And guess what? 61% of them said? Entrepreneurship. I need to make my own job. I need to run my own business. Now, whether this is misguided or not is a whole different conversation. But their hopes for their future is based on their ability to do it themselves. So employment is actually far second to their requirement for entrepreneurship. Now, the question then is, within the companies and the millennials that we employ and everybody who's looking to go and run their own business, how do we tap into this need to ensure that they can build that innovation within your own business? How do they run their business in your business to make your business bigger? Because that's all they want, the opportunity to do it themselves. And I think that's a real task that leadership needs to take into consideration as they start to see more millennials coming into the workplace. The second thing is that they are the tech-enabled mass. They're overwhelmingly excited about technology. In fact, we're finding that the African millennial is leapfrogging technology than most other markets, even than most of the Western markets. So they're a lot more tech-savvy, and their perception of tech is as an enabler. So it's really impacting their life both ways. So the typical millennial believes that by understanding tech, they can get ahead, they can get better, they can do things quicker, they can make it faster. Now, in this space is also the discussion around how do we ensure that our workplaces provide them with or enable them to be able to utilize tech to advance the jobs that they're doing, because that's how they play. This is how they live. And tech does not necessarily mean automation of everything. Tech is just simply, are we providing the right platforms that they can tap into that can make this passion and desire for tech real in their workplace? Because remember what I said, their passion and their vocation is one. They don't see it as two separate things. Then we ask them, what drives you the most when you're choosing a career? This is really interesting. Money didn't even come up here. Personal growth and development. Like nobody was, the guy's adding $200, and his first choice is, I want to go to a company that's going to upskill me, give me better skills, train me, give me better opportunities, not give me better money. So it's a different thinking, because the other thing that we find that came out of the study was also their desire to do more work socially, which was completely different from what we think the typical millennial is looking for. So the idea that they want development and they want to be trained and they want to be upskilled is really important. So we know that we can't all be entrepreneurs, but we feel like we can be. We want to feel like we're an entrepreneur. So how do you make somebody feel like an entrepreneur in your own space? So look at specific measurable ways that we can actually provide professional growth opportunities for millennials. Are we speaking to their aspirations? Are we speaking to their passions? And how would we tap into those passions to ensure that we can be able to keep them for the long term within our organizations? So the key takeouts for us is the workspace and brand love is one and the same thing. So we're finding that they want to work for companies that are trustworthy, and they admire companies that will help them build the future. So they're looking for a workplace that can be seen as meaning something. So remember that blank space we talked about? 10% of them just don't see us as doing any good. So if we're asking ourselves, why are they in and out of the workplace so often? I think some of the answers become very, very clear. Second thing is number one. The anxiety that we're seeing in the workplace on tech and millennials is they've seen their parents lose a lot of jobs through this whole sort of space of automation, and they want to be able to ensure that you can future-proof them. So our transformation and the transformation opportunities that we do from a tech space should be able to future-proof their jobs. So allow them to lead the tech innovation in your companies. And they're looking for new ways to be able to connect. The second thing, they care about security, safety, and jobs. So they're seeking a broader social purpose. So give them something to build their social purpose. Now, a lot of the CSR projects that we do, and I think that's why I got really interested in this space of engagement, is sort of looking at how we're really engaging our workforce and millennials in the projects that we're doing for social good. What they're saying is, I want more purpose in my job. It's not just a job. The third thing is recognition for hard work. Now, we're finding a lot of sensitivity when companies are drawing inspiration from their local environments. So what we're seeing is a lot of companies that are kind of building their space, utilizing perhaps more informal workers. They're looking at artists and they're looking at sculptors and they're saying, well, if you're going to draw inspiration from these people, what are you giving back? And it's going beyond the press release and the influencer stories. They want it to be real, and they want to see that you're actually recognizing the places that we're getting inspiration from within the community. So community and affiliation is really, really important for the millennial. And the freedom to make choices. This is a really tough one, because what it's saying is that your internal culture is part of your customer-facing brand. So whatever it is that you're doing inside your company is going to appear on social media eventually. So you can make the picture good or bad depending on how you want it to seem. So in this kind of digital era that we're seeing, millennials are co-creators. They're co-creators in providing value for your company. So if your company is a brand and you've got 50% of your workforce as millennials, you can utilize them to build strong value and strong affiliation for your business. So I'll take pause there for a minute because I think there's a lot of questions that are about to shoot at me and I'm willing to take them. So I'll just take questions coming out of the data. The data is actually quite extensive, so I've sort of distilled it into what we think were the relevant 3 currencies. And we've also consolidated it. So if you want data that's kind of specific to Ghana, or Accra, or Lagos, or Nairobi, and hopefully next year, Johannesburg, it will be available.
So my question is more from a research perspective.
Yes.
You may have touched on it. Being from Tanzania, I'd be wary to be put in the same bucket with Kenya. And therefore, I put it to you that I feel your data is still skewed given the selection of the clusters you picked. So I'm interested to understand how you decided on Accra, Nairobi, and Lagos in terms of what you were trying to capture, given the sheer size of the economies we're talking about, as well as the advancements in these areas. Thank you.
So it's a fair question because, we couldn't do the study in all the markets at the same time. And we sort of looked at where the key influences come from within the context of an East Africa, for example. So we couldn't do all the 8 countries within that context, and we couldn't do all the countries within the West African context. And the French territories are completely different. So for the first study, we sort of said, let's look at where the key influences will lie. And coming out of that, we believe that it will capture, to a large degree, a lot of what the spillover is within it. So we will continue to track the study. Our hope is that we can do all 52 countries over the next 3 or 4 years so that we can see whether there is real variations or trends. And I know Tanzania doesn't believe that they are as close to the Kenyans as they are, but really, the only difference was we gave you the mountain. Otherwise, we're just brothers and sisters.
Hi, I'm Sally. I'm from South Africa. I just want to ask more your opinion. Do you believe a lot of companies put innovation programs, are going very strongly with their innovation programs that they're launching to internal innovation where people can submit their ideas? How do you see that speaking to the millennial need for entrepreneurship? Do you think that the two can be tied together well?
I think there's massive opportunity because I think there's it's really difficult in the workplace because you're dealing with such diversity, and I don't think millennials are special. I really think they're not a demographic, they're really a psychographic. And they are not any more special than any other generation that has come over time. I think all we're seeing is that because of their ability to leapfrog technology, they are behaving in slightly different ways than previous generations. I do believe that within the context of the workplace, I think everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. I think everybody wants to be able to innovate. And if we can create programs that allow for that entrepreneurship, component. And we're not seeing a lot of it. We're really not seeing a lot of it within the context of the African continent. And there's huge space for us to be able to take it to the next level. We see it in the tech-led companies, the IBMs, the Googles. We're seeing a lot of that in those platforms. Those are global programs. By the time they distill them into the continent, I truly believe they're just nice to haves by the time they get to us. And local companies must really take the initiative.
Okay, thank you. My name is Dixon, also from Tanzania. Ooh. So based on the research that you just presented, we are saying that only 1% of the millennials are actually influenced by social media bloggers. But we are seeing a lot of brands investing a lot in the use of influencers, and a lot of marketing professionals are incorporating influencers into their strategies. So based on this study and your own experience, what do you say of the effectiveness of influencers, and should businesses stop using them altogether in driving messaging?
Look, I think there is a role for influencers, but I do think that there must be a match. So all they're saying is that, do their values, the influencers' value, match the value of your company and the value that your workforce places on them? So what the study is saying is that only 1% believe them to be a source of truth. So if you're using your influencers to be able to, as a source of information about your company, I'd say stop it. You're wasting money. If you want a true source of information about your company, update your website and update it regularly. Make your website as informative as you possibly can, because that's where people are going to go to seek truth. If you want to provide entertainment and fake news, go ahead. Carry on with an influencer marketing strategy. But be clear around what it is that you're doing, because I do think they do a lot more harm to brands and to companies than the amount of money that we're putting behind it.